not seeing that the degree to which those kinds of stories that people tell themselves about the world that they live in are not just vestigial mythological hangovers, but are crucial to what we call culture. We're crucial to what we call what we recognize as the most moving, significant, potent forms of searching for meaning. And are you never concerned, as I am, Steve, sometimes when I read Richard Dawkins, let's say, a remarkable figure, that though I agree with everything he says, I'm made uneasy by the slight tone of fatuous certitude that creeps into it? Are you never made uneasy by the feeling that exactly the lesson that we claim to want to derive from Darwin, that is about the virtues of modesty, the enormity of a world that we don't understand compared to our specific understanding, are you never concerned that kind of slips in the back door, and that we have to be doubly, as Darwinians, doubly cautious, doubly, in a certain sense, conservative, doubly aware of those risks?
Well, certainly the whole scientific, or more generally naturalistic, secular mindset forces you to have skepticism, including about your deepest held beliefs. That's the origin of modernity. Really, modern philosophy is in skepticism, in avoiding dogma, authority, feelings of certainty from emotional conviction, and to be able to question anything. I mean, that's the beginning of science, that's the beginning of philosophy. And having a Darwinian point of view, realizing that everything that I'm thinking with right now is itself an organ that has its quirks, that has its history, that has its limitations, is even another ground for a kind of humility or modesty. Namely, no matter how certain it seems to me, well, it wouldn't it? That's all I have to think with. So I think of it.
It's a certitude machine, isn't it?
It's a certitude machine, exactly. And one of the things we know as psychologists is that we're apt to be more certain than we have any right to be. And keeping that in mind, I think, is a kind of break on a kind of overweening confidence that we've figured it all out. And in fact, I would argue that it compares favorably with a religious mindset, which depends on things like revelation, faith, dogma, tradition, authority, and so on.
You can have Darwinism without certitude, but you cannot have religion without dogma. And
certainly without faith. And faith is believing in something without having a good reason to, and I think that's a bad thing.
All right, I'll buy that. Let me turn to all of you. We'd love to take some questions, and we're going to break with live tradition and actually recognize you and ask you to stand up and speak. And I think there are microphones going to be passed around at either side. The first question is always the hardest. There are mics on each side. Someone speak up for gentleman here.
Yes. Is it on?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It's not that big a room. You can just
Is it on?
shout.
I wanted to know where you stand on inherited behavior, and particularly instinct. If I can give an example, for instance, if you raise a bird in isolation, never has any interaction with any other bird, it still will know how to build a nest. It still knows that from instinct. And according to classical Darwinism, I guess, you would say that somewhere along the line there had been a mutation which made this bird able to build a nest. So if behavior is not inherited, I'm wondering, it seems a little unlikely to me that there would be a mutation that would all of a sudden make a bird able to build a nest. So where do you stand on that question?
Go ahead.
No. I stand nowhere. I claim no expertise on instincts of
This is certainly a topic that Darwin did write about, and he was adamant that instincts, like morphological traits, parts of our body, have an evolutionary history. And in many cases, was able to sketch a number of plausible intermediate stages, even in quite complex forms of behavior, like nest building in birds. That it's unlikely that it was one mutation. almost certainly not, just because the laws of probability would say that if you make a random change to the genome, it's not going to grant the ability to do something complex and adaptive like build a nest. More likely, there's always an enormous number of mutations kind of sitting around in the background, some of which increase the likelihood of behavior that in certain circumstances moves you a little closer to something that's useful, and that over many generations of mutations and sexual recombination and selection, you get behavior that becomes more and more complex. Following Darwin, this all goes back to Darwin, instincts as well as organs have an evolutionary history which is amenable to the theory of natural selection.
I wonder if we might contextualize Darwin a little bit in terms of you discussed his sort of place in modern philosophy to a certain extent, naturalism and humanism. But I wonder if there's a certain continuum that we could discuss it, and it's a very broad topic. But you've addressed sympathy a great deal, and sympathy is, of course, a very interesting idea. Coming out of 18th century philosophy, theories of moral sentiments and Scottish Enlightenment and Hume and Smith. But I wonder if we could sort of address the question of whether there's something in humanism and naturalism in modern philosophy which sort of necessitates Darwin, and instead of just saying that, well, we have Darwin and then the rest is history, but really seeing Darwin as a product of his time as well.
Well, let me deal with that in a couple of different ways. It's certainly true, and it's been one of the great acquisitions of Darwin scholarship in the last 40 years, I suppose, to understand that Darwin, contrary to the widely spread, widely disseminated picture of him as a kind of innocent naturalist who stumbled on the world's greatest idea, that Darwin was philosophically very sophisticated and acutely aware both of the origins of his ideas and of their consequences. You see that most wonderfully in one of the great books of human history, the 1838 notebooks, 1838 and 1839 notebooks, where Darwin is specifically reading Locke, for instance. He's reading Plato and saying, you know, if you could reinterpret all this stuff on biological grounds, it might all be true, but you could actually demonstrate it. There's a wonderful moment when he's reading Plato, and he says, and Plato's saying that you can explain our instincts in terms of the preexistence of the soul, and Darwin writes in the margin, for preexistence of the soul, read monkeys, which in one moment, that metaphysics has collapsed into biology. And it's a great moment in the human mind. I think that it's certainly true that in that way, Darwin is part of his time, part of the mind of his time, part of the thinking of his time. Though it's very interesting and I think significant that contrary to either the tales of left or right, Darwin, from the moment Origin of Species was first published, it was embraced by every part of the political spectrum. Karl Marx, as you know, loved it. For Marx, it was the breakthrough book, and he tried to court Darwin throughout his life. We know, sadly, about the embrace of what would eventually become called social Darwinism, not called that at the time. So you have an extreme right-wing version of it. You have a Christian embrace of Darwinism, and you have a liberal embrace in the person of someone like John Stuart Mill. So it seems to me that exactly because Darwinism in effect serves and helps so many different programs, that we keep coming back to the actual truth or falsity, the actual content of its empirical claims, which are certainly rooted in the thought of its time, but aren't dependent on them. The odd thing about Darwinism, about the idea of theory of evolution through natural selection, is that, to the best of our knowledge, and from that data, it turns out to be true. It actually describes the history of life on this planet better than any other idea. So I think we have to simultaneously, absolutely, place Darwin not just as a kind of unconscious part of his time, imitating, putting the ideas of free market capitalism into inserting them in nature, but as a conscious, one of the world's great thinkers, but at the same time recognize that the question of the truth or falsity of Darwinism is a real question that can be judged by scientific and empirical tests. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's on.
Is it on? Rather than preface these, oh, there I go. Rather than preface these, I'd just like to ask 3 quick questions. First, are not all forms, living and fossilized, transitional in some sense? The other question is, how do you feel about other primates being granted human rights? And lastly,